After being rescued from a fire by a firefighter, the millionaire was stunned when he saw his scar. The same one his brother had when he disappeared 18 years ago. The day had started like any other for Ethan Williams, caught in the usual whirlwind of business meetings and high-stakes negotiations. His life as a millionaire entrepreneur was defined by control, every decision calculated, every move part of a larger strategy. But as he stood in a high-rise building in the heart of New York City, something beyond his control was about to change everything. Ethan was finalizing a deal with a partner when the unmistakable scent of smoke hit his nostrils. At first, it was faint, like someone had lit a cigarette in the hallway. But then, the fire alarms began to scream, echoing through the building. Panic set in as people rushed out of their offices, shouting, grabbing whatever they could. It took Ethan a second to register what was happening, but the growing sound of footsteps and the smell of burning plastics snapped him into focus. He looked toward the large glass windows of the conference room, and through the reflection, he could see the faint glow of orange light creeping along the hallway walls. "Everyone, get out," someone yelled, and Ethan grabbed his briefcase, instinctively protecting what he could. The heat was suffocating as Ethan joined the stream of people heading toward the emergency exits. Thick, dark smoke billowed through the air, clouding his vision and filling his lungs. He coughed violently, trying to cover his mouth with his sleeve. It was chaos, people pushing, screaming, fighting for their lives. As they descended the staircase, the flames seemed to follow, licking at their heels with an unrelenting hunger. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt fear. Not the everyday anxiety of business deals or financial losses, but real, primal fear. The kind that makes you feel small and powerless. By the time he reached the lower floors, the smoke was unbearable. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burned, and his vision blurred. Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, he stumbled, collapsing to the ground. The world around him spun, and everything faded into a haze of heat and smoke. Suddenly, strong arms lifted him from the ground. "Hang in there," a voice said, steady and calm despite the chaos. Ethan barely had the strength to open his eyes, but when he did, he saw the man pulling him to safety. The firefighter wore his helmet low over his face, but as they emerged into the fresh air outside, something about him caught Ethan's attention. A scar, a long, jagged line running across the firefighter's face, from his temple down to his jawline. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The scar was identical to the one his brother Daniel had gotten years ago in a childhood accident. It had been 18 years since Daniel disappeared, 18 years since Ethan had last seen that scar. His mind raced, confusion and disbelief washing over him. Could it be? "Are you all right?" the firefighter asked, snapping Ethan out of his thoughts. His voice was deep, steady, no hint of recognition. "Yeah," Ethan managed to cough out, though his lungs still felt like they were on fire. "Thank you." The firefighter gave him a nod and started to walk away, but Ethan, still in shock, grabbed his arm. "Wait, what's your name?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The man hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Jack." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of other firefighters and paramedics that swarmed the scene. Ethan stood there, watching as Jack walked away, his mind reeling. The resemblance was uncanny, the scar, the eyes, even the way he moved. But how could it be? Daniel had disappeared after the fire at their family's farm all those years ago, presumed dead. No one had heard from him since. Ethan shook his head, trying to clear the haze of disbelief. He was probably just hallucinating, the result of the shock and the near-death experience. But something deep inside him wouldn't let go of the idea. He had to know more. As the fire trucks and ambulances swarmed the scene, Ethan stood to the side, his mind racing. The odds were impossible, but the fire and the scar were too much to ignore. He had spent years searching for closure about Daniel, and now, in the most unlikely of places, a new door had opened. Could this man, this firefighter named Jack, really be his brother? Or was it just a cruel coincidence? For the rest of that day, Ethan couldn't focus on anything else. The faces of his business partners, the voices of his colleagues, they all faded into the background as his thoughts circled around Jack, that scar, and the past he thought he had buried. The day he lost Daniel had been the worst of his life, a wound that had never fully healed. And now, it felt like someone had ripped that wound open again. He couldn't ignore it. He needed answers. And deep down, Ethan knew he wouldn't rest until he found them. That night, Ethan sat in his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, the city's lights twinkling below him. Normally, this view helped him unwind after long days filled with high-stakes business deals. But tonight, his mind was far from the world of profits and contracts. He couldn't stop thinking about the firefighter, Jack, and that scar. The more Ethan thought about it, the more convinced he became. It wasn't just the scar. It was the way Jack carried himself, the look in his eyes. It was so familiar, like a distant memory brought back to life. The image of his brother, Daniel, from all those years ago, was burned into his brain. They had been inseparable as kids, spending endless summers together on their family's farm outside Dallas. But everything changed that one fateful day. Ethan was barely 22, fresh out of college and full of ambition, while Daniel was still just a teenager, barely 16, full of rebellion and anger. They had fought, about what? Ethan could hardly remember now. What stuck with him, though, was the aftermath, the fire that had consumed the family farm later that night, the one that no one could explain. Daniel had disappeared that same night. The authorities had searched for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. Ethan's parents had been devastated, and Ethan had carried the guilt with him for years, wondering if their fight had driven Daniel to leave, or worse, if he had perished in the fire. 18 years was a long time to hold on to that kind of guilt, but it had never fully left him. Now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope, and it terrified him. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number of a private investigator he had used a few years back. Anthony West was one of the best in the business, the kind of guy who could dig up information on anyone, no matter how deep it was buried. Ethan stared at the number for a moment, his thumb hovering over the call button. Was he really doing this? Was it even possible that Jack could be Daniel? He knew it sounded crazy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something worth investigating. He pressed the button. "Ethan, long time no talk," Anthony answered after a few rings, his voice casual but professional. "I need your help with something." "Unusual," Ethan said, pacing across the floor, unable to keep still. He explained the situation briefly. The fire, the firefighter, the scar. He left out the emotional weight of the story, not wanting to sound irrational. But Anthony had known Ethan long enough to sense when something was serious. "I'll see what I can find," Anthony replied. "Send me what you've got on this guy. His name, any details you remember. I'll start digging." Ethan hung up, feeling both relieved and anxious. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he needed answers, and Anthony was his best shot at getting them. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a heavy sense of anticipation. He wasn't sure how long it would take for Anthony to get back to him, but waiting had never been one of his strong suits. He spent the day in meetings, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying memories of Daniel, their childhood, and that night when everything had changed. He remembered the way Daniel used to look up to him, always following him around, asking questions about everything. Ethan had been the responsible one, the one with plans and dreams, while Daniel had always been more carefree, more willing to take risks. Ethan had never understood why Daniel seemed so angry those last few months before he disappeared, and the guilt of not being able to fix things between them had haunted him ever since. By the afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from Anthony. "Meet me at my office. I've got something you'll want to see." Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed his coat and headed for the door, practically running to the elevator. The ride to Anthony's office felt like an eternity, and when he finally arrived, the investigator greeted him with a folder in hand, a grim expression on his face. "Tell me you found something," Ethan said, barely able to contain his impatience. Anthony nodded, gesturing for him to sit down. I did some digging on Jack. The guy's clean, as far as I can tell. But there are some gaps in his history. He was adopted as a kid, around the same age your brother disappeared. Ethan's stomach flipped. This was the kind of detail he had been hoping for, but dreading at the same time. I can't confirm anything yet, Anthony continued, but it's strange. Jack was adopted by a family in upstate New York, but there's little record of his life before that. No birth certificate, no real details on where he came from. It's like he just appeared. Ethan leaned forward, his mind spinning. You think it's possible? Anthony shrugged. It's possible, but we need more than this. If you're serious about finding out, I'll need to dig deeper. Track down his adoption records. See if there's anything else that connects the dots. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. This was bigger than he had imagined, and it was about to get a lot more complicated. Ethan left Anthony's office with a mix of excitement and dread weighing on him. The information he had learned wasn't definitive, but it was enough to keep him on edge, to fuel that small flicker of hope he had been holding on to. Jack's adoption at the right age, the mysterious gaps in his history. It all seemed too coincidental to ignore. Back in his apartment, Ethan paced the floor, trying to make sense of it all. His mind raced through possibilities. If Jack really was Daniel, how had he ended up in New York? Why had he never come back? And most importantly, why couldn't Jack remember? Ethan sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began typing. He wanted to know more about Jack before he jumped to any conclusions. He had spent years in business. Researching people was second nature to him. It didn't take long to find the local firefighter station where Jack worked. The website listed its staff, and sure enough, there was Jack. Full name, Jack Carter. The name wasn't familiar, but the face. Ethan's stomach tightened as he stared at the picture. That was him, the man who had pulled him from the fire. Ethan kept scrolling through the page, trying to glean more information. There wasn't much, just a brief bio mentioning Jack's background, his adoption, and how he had been with the department for several years. But something about his eyes in the photo struck Ethan again. The more he looked, the more convinced he became that Jack could be his brother. But could Ethan really confront him again? Jack had already denied having any connection to Daniel, and Ethan had to admit it sounded insane. How do you walk up to a man and tell him you think he's your brother? Long thought dead. Ethan shook his head, trying to focus. He needed more than just a hunch and a gut feeling. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Anthony. I'm pulling some records, but adoption files can be tricky to access. It might take a few days. Ethan sighed. Waiting was the last thing he wanted to do, but he knew Anthony was right. Adoption records were sensitive, and if Jack had been adopted under unusual circumstances, it might take even longer to get to the truth. Still, Ethan couldn't just sit around and wait for information. He had never been good at waiting. A sudden thought struck him. If Jack was really Daniel, maybe there were people in Jack's life who knew more about his past. People who had seen him grow up, who might know things that Jack himself didn't remember. It was a long shot, but worth exploring. Ethan grabbed his phone and pulled up the number for the fire station. His heart raced as he dialed, not quite sure what he was going to say. After a few rings, a woman answered. Station 28, how can I help you? Hi, I was hoping to speak with one of your firefighters, Ethan said, his voice sounding more nervous than he intended. Jack Carter, is he available? There was a pause on the other end, and Ethan held his breath, waiting for the response. Jack's out on a call right now, the woman replied. But I can leave a message for him. Is this about something specific? Ethan hesitated. He hadn't thought this part through. No, that's okay. I'll try again later. Thanks. He hung up, feeling a rush of frustration. Maybe this wasn't the best approach, but before he could dwell on it, another idea formed. If Jack wasn't available, perhaps there were others at the station who could tell him more about him. The next day, Ethan decided to go to the fire station in person. It was a bold move, but he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. The closer he got to uncovering the truth, the more urgent it felt. When he arrived at Station 28, the building was quiet. A few fire trucks sat parked outside, and the smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air as a couple of firefighters lounged by the entrance, chatting casually. Ethan straightened his jacket, feeling out of place in his designer clothes among the worn uniforms and rugged men. One of the firefighters noticed him and walked over, giving him a friendly nod. "Can I help you?" "Yeah, I'm looking for Jack Carter," Ethan said, keeping his tone casual. I wanted to thank him personally. He pulled me out of a fire a few days ago." The firefighter smiled. "Yeah, Jack's a good guy. Saved a lot of people over the years. He's out on a call right now, but he should be back soon if you want to stick around." Ethan nodded, trying to play it cool. "Sure, I can wait." As he waited, Ethan scanned the building, taking in the framed photos on the walls, firefighters at various events, team photos, charity runs. One photo caught his eye. It was Jack, grinning with his arm around another firefighter, both of them holding a trophy for some department competition. Jack looked younger, happier, less weighed down. A voice pulled Ethan from his thoughts. "Hey, you're the guy from the fire, right?" Ethan turned to see a middle-aged man walking toward him. He was broad-shouldered, with a well-worn face that spoke of years in the field. "I'm Chief Davis," the man said, extending a hand. "Heard Jack pulled you out. Hell of a thing." "Yeah, he did," Ethan replied, shaking his hand. "I'm just here to thank him." "It was a close call." The chief nodded, his eyes studying Ethan for a moment. "Jack's a solid guy. Quiet, though. Doesn't talk much about his personal life. Hell, none of us even knew he was adopted until a couple years ago. He keeps things pretty close to the chest." Ethan's heart skipped. "Adopted?" "Yeah, came upstate when he was a kid. His folks were older, passed away a few years back. Good people. Jack doesn't say much about it, though. He's not one to dwell on the past." Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. The pieces were falling into place, but he still needed more. As they chatted, Ethan realized that confronting Jack again was inevitable. He couldn't let this go, not now that he was so close to the truth. But he had to be careful. One wrong move, and Jack could shut him out completely. Ethan left the fire station feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. Chief Davis's words had stirred something in him, confirming what he had been suspecting all along. Jack's past was murky, filled with gaps, and that only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Jack didn't talk about his past, didn't seem to remember much about his childhood, almost as if it was wiped clean. Was it possible Jack didn't know who he really was? Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon going over everything he'd learned so far, piecing together every detail like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Jack's adoption, the missing years from his childhood, the scar, it all pointed to something bigger, something Ethan couldn't ignore. He had been careful not to let his emotions cloud his judgment, but this was different. This wasn't just business. This was family. A notification buzzed on Ethan's phone, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Anthony. "I found something interesting. You're going to want to see this. Meet me at the usual spot." Ethan grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his pulse quickening with every step. He wasn't sure what Anthony had found, but he had a feeling it was going to be the piece of the puzzle he had been waiting for. When Ethan arrived at the small, dimly lit bar where he and Anthony usually met, he saw the investigator sitting at a corner table, a manila folder in front of him. Anthony looked up as Ethan approached, a serious expression on his face. "Tell me you've got something," Ethan said as he sat down, unable to hide the urgency in his voice. Anthony slid the folder across the table. "I've been digging through some old records, adoption files mostly. It wasn't easy, but I managed to track down some information about Jack's adoption." Ethan opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His heart raced as he read the details. Jack had been adopted at the age of 6 by a couple living in upstate New York. The records were sparse, but one thing stood out. There was no mention of his birth parents. In fact, there was almost nothing about his life before the adoption. Anthony leaned in, lowering his voice. It's like he just appeared out of thin air. Ethan. No birth certificate, no records of where he was before the adoption. Just a few vague details about him being found wandering alone near a small town upstate. The adoptive parents never questioned it, apparently. Ethan's mind was spinning. What about the scar? Is there anything that mentions how he got it? Anthony shook his head. No, but if he was adopted at 6, right, it's possible he had the scar when they found him. There's no mention of any specific injury. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. If Jack really was Daniel, then it made sense that there would be gaps in his history, his disappearance after the fire, the lack of any official records. But why didn't Jack remember? What had happened in those years before the adoption? Anthony studied Ethan for a moment before speaking again. Look, man, I know this is personal for you, but you've got to be careful. If Jack doesn't remember, pushing him too hard might backfire. He's lived his whole life as someone else. Finding out he's been living a lie could mess him up. Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of Anthony's warning. This wasn't just about finding his brother. It was about unraveling a life that Jack had built, one that might not survive the truth. Still, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was so close. He had to keep going, but he knew he needed to tread carefully. As Ethan left the bar, the city's night air wrapped around him like a shroud. The weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him, making every step feel heavier than the last. He knew what he had to do next. He had to confront Jack again, but this time, with more than just questions. He needed proof, something that would force Jack to confront the possibility that his life wasn't what he thought it was. The next day, Ethan made a call to the fire station, but Jack wasn't on duty. Frustrated but determined, Ethan decided to visit Jack at home. If he was going to get answers, he needed to talk to Jack in a setting where they could both be honest, away from the noise of the station or the pressure of work. He had to approach this delicately, without sending Jack running. It wasn't hard to find Jack's address. Anthony had already provided it. As Ethan pulled up to the modest house in a quiet neighborhood, he felt a surge of nerves. What if Jack slammed the door in his face? What if he refused to listen? Ethan took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A few moments later, it opened, and there stood Jack, wearing a worn t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp from a shower. His eyes widened when he saw Ethan standing on his doorstep. "You again?" Jack asked, his voice a mix of surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone calm and steady. "Please, it's important." Jack hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. "Fine, but make it quick." Ethan stepped into the small, cozy living room, his eyes briefly scanning the space. It was simple, unassuming, nothing like the life of a man who had come from wealth and privilege. Jack motioned for Ethan to sit, but remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. "Look, I don't know what you think you're going to find out by showing up here," Jack said, his voice edged with frustration. "But I already told you, I don't know anything about your brother. I'm not him." "I get that," Ethan said, trying to remain calm. "But you don't know everything about your own past either. I've been doing some digging, and I found out things that don't add up. You were adopted when you were 6, right?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, so..." Ethan swallowed, knowing this was the moment that could change everything. "There are gaps in your history, things that don't make sense. You don't remember where you were before that, do you?" Jack's expression hardened. "What are you getting at?" Ethan pulled the manila folder from his jacket and placed it on the coffee table in front of him. "You don't remember because you weren't Jack Carter back then. You were Daniel Williams, my brother." For a long, tense moment, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jack stood frozen, staring down at the folder on the table as if it were a ticking time bomb. His expression shifted from confusion to frustration, and finally, to something closer to anger. "You've got to be kidding me," Jack muttered, shaking his head as he stepped away from the table, as though putting distance between himself and the implications of Ethan's words. This is insane. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he remained calm. He knew this reaction was coming. Jack had every right to be skeptical. After all, what Ethan was suggesting wasn't just unbelievable, it was life-shattering. "I'm serious, Jack," Ethan said, leaning forward, his voice steady but urgent. "You've always felt like something was missing, haven't you? The gaps in your memory, the fact that you don't remember anything from before you were 6. Doesn't that bother you? Don't you wonder where you really came from?" Jack crossed his arms and looked away, refusing to meet Ethan's eyes. "Look, I've made my peace with it. My parents told me everything I needed to know. They took me in when I had no one, and that's all that matters." Ethan shook his head. "But what if they didn't tell you everything? What if they didn't know the whole story themselves?" Jack's jaw clenched, his frustration mounting. "I don't need to know. I don't want to know. Whatever happened before they found me, it's in the past. I've moved on." "But you haven't," Ethan pressed. "You've just buried it. Jack, you deserve to know the truth about who you really are. This is bigger than either of us. This isn't just about finding my brother. It's about you finding out who you really are." Jack turned around and stared at Ethan, his eyes burning with intensity. "You don't get to come into my life and tell me who I am. You don't know me." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to stay calm despite the rising tension in the room. "You're right. I don't know you, not fully. But I knew Daniel. And if there's even the slightest chance that you're him, don't you think it's worth looking into?" Jack was silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. Ethan could see the conflict written all over his face. He was pushing hard, he knew that, but he couldn't stop now. Jack needed to hear this, even if it was painful. "Do you remember anything at all?" Ethan asked, his voice softer now. "Any flashes? Any memories from before you were adopted? Anything that feels off?" Jack ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. "I don't know. Maybe sometimes I get these flashes. Nothing specific. Just feelings, like something's missing. But I figured it was normal. Lots of adopted kids feel like that, right?" Ethan nodded. "Maybe. But what if those flashes are pieces of your past, pieces of a life you can't remember because it was taken from you?" Jack's face was unreadable as he turned back to face Ethan. "What are you saying? That I'm supposed to just accept that my whole life has been a lie?" "I'm not asking you to accept anything right now," Ethan said, his tone measured. "All I'm asking is that you consider the possibility. Look at the facts. Look at the gaps in your past, the way everything seems to line up. Don't you want to know for sure?" Jack's fists tightened at his sides, and for a moment Ethan thought he might walk out, that he might just slam the door on everything and refuse to listen any further. But instead, Jack took a deep breath and sank into the chair across from Ethan, rubbing his temples as if trying to ease the weight of the conversation. "You really think I'm your brother?" Jack asked, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. Ethan nodded slowly. "I do." Jack leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. "And what if you're wrong?" "Then we figure that out," Ethan replied. "But I don't think I am." Jack sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "So, what now? What do you want me to do?" Ethan felt a surge of hope, just a flicker, but enough to keep pushing forward. "I want to keep looking into it. If you'll let me, I can help you figure out where you came from, what happened before the adoption. If I'm wrong, then we move on. But if I'm right, you'll have the answers you've been missing all these years." Jack shook his head, as if the weight of it all was finally catching up to him. "I don't even know what to think anymore." "I get it," Ethan said softly. "Believe me, I've been carrying this for a long time. I never thought I'd get any answers either." The room fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't the tense, uncomfortable silence that had filled the space before. It was quieter, more reflective. Jack seemed to be processing everything, trying to make sense of a lifetime of questions that had never been answered. Finally, Jack looked back at Ethan, his expression softer than before. "I'll think about it, but I'm not making any promises." Ethan nodded. "That's all I'm asking." With that, Jack stood up and motioned toward the door. "I think we're done for now." Ethan rose to his feet, grabbing the manila folder from the table. "I'll be in touch. Take your time with this. It's a lot, I know." Jack walked him to the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. As Ethan stepped outside, he glanced back at Jack, feeling the weight of everything that had been said. It wasn't a breakthrough, not yet. But it was something, a crack in the wall that Jack had built around himself, and maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something more. As Ethan walked back to his car, his mind turned to another question, one that had been lingering in the background ever since he'd started this journey. What had their father known? Ethan had spent years trying to piece together what had happened the night Daniel disappeared, but there were too many unanswered questions. His father, always secretive, had taken much of his knowledge to the grave. But Ethan had a feeling there were still more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Secrets that might explain why Daniel had been taken away, why their family had been torn apart. It was time to dig deeper into the past, even if it meant uncovering things he wasn't ready to face. The next few days passed in a blur for Ethan. He threw himself back into his work, attending meetings, closing deals, and making appearances where necessary. But his mind was always somewhere else. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about Jack, about Daniel, and the truth that lay just out of reach. The encounter at Jack's house had left him restless, and the thought that his brother might still be alive consumed him more than ever. At night, when the city lights dimmed and the noise of Manhattan quieted, Ethan would sit by the window, staring out into the skyline. Memories of Daniel as a kid would flood back, how he used to follow Ethan around the farm, always looking up to his older brother, always trying to keep up. Those were simpler times before the fire, before the tragedy that had ripped their family apart. Ethan had spent the last 18 years wondering if he could have done more, if he could have stopped Daniel from disappearing. And now, after all this time, the answer might be within his grasp. But Jack wasn't making it easy, and Ethan understood why. Learning that your entire life was a lie was enough to shake anyone to their core. Still, Ethan couldn't let it go. He needed closure. He needed to know if Jack was really his brother, and if so, why their father had lied all those years ago. It was late one evening when Ethan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He glanced at the screen and felt his heart skip a beat. Jack. The message was short. "We need to talk. Meet me at the station tomorrow. Noon." Ethan stared at the message, the weight of those words settling over him. He didn't know what Jack was going to say, but the fact that he had reached out meant something. Maybe Jack had thought about it. Maybe he was ready to open up. The next day, Ethan arrived at the fire station just before noon. The air was crisp, the sun high in the sky, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the atmosphere as Ethan stepped through the station's doors. The firefighters inside were going about their business, prepping equipment, chatting, laughing. But Ethan's focus was on the man standing at the back of the station, leaning against a fire truck with his arms crossed. Jack. Jack's expression was unreadable as Ethan approached, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a seriousness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Ethan braced himself for whatever was coming next. "Thanks for meeting me," Ethan said, trying to gauge Jack's mood. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, staring at Ethan like he was trying to figure something out. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about everything you said." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And..." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to think. Part of me wants to believe you're just some guy who's lost his mind. But there's another part of me that wonders if you're right. If there's something I don't remember, something I need to know." Ethan nodded slowly. "I get it. It's a lot to take in." Jack's eyes flashed with frustration. It's more than that. You're asking me to question everything. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my life. Do you have any idea what that's like? Ethan swallowed hard. I can imagine. But I'm not doing this to mess with your life, Jack. I'm doing this because I believe you deserve to know the truth, whatever that truth is. Jack fell silent, his gaze dropping to the floor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan could feel the weight of Jack's internal struggle, the battle between wanting to hold on to the life he had built and the nagging need to uncover the truth. I did some digging, Jack finally said, breaking the silence. About my adoption. You were right. There are gaps in the story. Things that don't add up. My adoptive parents never told me much about where I came from, and honestly, I never pushed for answers. I guess part of me didn't want to know. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What did you find? Jack let out a long breath. Not much, but enough to know that there's more to the story than I was told. My parents always said they found me in some small town upstate, that I'd been wandering alone when the authorities picked me up. But there's no record of what happened before that. No one knows where I came from, or who I was before. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. That lines up with everything I've found, too. Jack, I think you really are Daniel. I think our father knew something he didn't tell anyone. And I think that's why you were given up for adoption. Jack looked at Ethan, his eyes searching for something. Truth, maybe, or answers that Ethan wasn't sure he had. But why? Why would someone do that? Why would your father, our father, just give me away? I don't know, Ethan admitted, but I think it has something to do with the fire. There was more to that night than what we were told. I've been digging into it, and there are a lot of unanswered questions. Jack shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. This is insane. My whole life, I thought I was just some kid who got lucky, adopted by good people, given a second chance. And now you're telling me that wasn't even real. It was real, Ethan said gently. The life you've built is real. Your parents loved you, Jack. That's not a lie, but your past, it's part of you, whether you remember it or not, and you deserve to know where you came from. Jack stood there staring at Ethan, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He was angry, frustrated, confused. But there was something else in his eyes, something that told Ethan he was starting to believe, starting to accept the possibility that his life wasn't what he thought it was. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice quiet, almost resigned. So what now? You dig up more dirt on our father and hope it leads to some big revelation. Ethan shook his head. No, I don't want to drag this out any longer than it needs to be. But I think there are answers we haven't uncovered yet. And I'm going to find them, whether you want to be part of that or not. Jack looked away, his jaw tight. I don't know if I can do this, Ethan. I don't know if I want to. Ethan nodded, understanding. You don't have to. But if you ever decide you want to know the truth, I'll be here. With that, Ethan turned and walked away, leaving Jack standing by the fire truck, lost in thought. As Ethan stepped outside, he felt the weight of the conversation settle over him. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, he felt like they were getting closer, closer to the truth, closer to the answers they had both been searching for, and closer to the secrets that their father had taken to his grave. The drive back to his apartment was a blur. Ethan's mind raced with everything Jack had said. There was no turning back now. Both of them were tangled in a web of secrets, and Ethan knew he had to keep pulling on the threads, no matter how deep the mystery ran. Jack was starting to come around, but Ethan could sense his hesitation, the fear of losing the life he had built. And Ethan understood. If Jack really was Daniel, the revelation would destroy the foundation of his entire existence. But there was no stopping now. Not when they were this close. Later that night, Ethan found himself at his desk, poring over the same documents, notes, and records he had gathered over the last few days. He stared at the adoption records again, trying to find anything that would tell him more about how Jack had come to live with the Carters. But the file was frustratingly vague, offering only the barest details of his adoption at the age of 6. No background, no birth records, just a name and a date. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was a message from Anthony. "I dug up some old files on your father. Looks like he kept a lot of secrets. We should talk." Ethan immediately texted back. "When? Tomorrow, my office," came the reply. Ethan set his phone down, his mind already racing. What could Anthony have found? His father had always been a complicated man, stern, secretive, and obsessed with protecting the family's reputation. But Ethan had never imagined that his father could be involved in something as dark as Daniel's disappearance. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Anthony's office feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. Anthony was sitting behind his cluttered desk, surrounded by stacks of files and papers. He waved Ethan in, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I've been looking into your father's business dealings from around the time your brother disappeared," Anthony began, flipping open a folder. "Turns out, your old man was involved in some pretty shady stuff. Real estate scams, financial manipulation, the kind of thing you keep off the books." Ethan leaned forward, his stomach churning. "What does this have to do with Daniel?" Anthony nodded grimly. "That's the thing. I found some correspondences, letters, notes, that sort of thing, between your father and some pretty unsavory characters. They were talking about loose ends and protecting the family. Around the same time, Daniel disappeared." Ethan's heart pounded. "What are you saying? My father had something to do with Daniel being taken away." "It looks that way," Anthony said, pushing the folder toward him. "I found this too. It's a letter from your mother." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he pulled the letter from the folder. The paper was old and worn, the ink slightly faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His mother's neat, delicate script filled the page. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then the truth has come out. I've carried this burden for years, but I couldn't let you or Daniel be hurt because of your father's mistakes. He made enemies, powerful ones, and they threatened to come after our family. I didn't know what else to do, so I gave Daniel away. It was the only way to protect him." Ethan's hands trembled as he read the words, each sentence hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Your father arranged for Daniel to be adopted in secret. We told you he was lost in the fire, but it was all a lie. I'm sorry, Ethan. I never wanted it to be this way. But there were people after us, dangerous people who would have done anything to get to your father. Giving Daniel away was the only way to keep him safe." The letter ended there, abruptly, as if his mother hadn't been able to bear writing anymore. Ethan sat back in his chair, the letter falling from his hands. His mind was spinning, the weight of his mother's confession crashing down on him. So it was true. Daniel, Jack, hadn't just disappeared. He had been given away, hidden from the world to protect him from the enemies their father had made. "Your mother knew the whole time," Anthony said quietly, watching Ethan's reaction. "She was trying to protect you both. But your father, well, he was more interested in protecting himself." Ethan couldn't breathe. His mother had carried this secret for years, protecting Daniel, protecting their family. And all this time, Ethan had believed that Daniel was dead. He had believed that the fire had taken him away, that there was no hope of ever finding him. But now, the truth was laid bare. Jack was Daniel. His brother had been alive all along, living a completely different life, unaware of who he truly was. Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing the room as his thoughts raced. "I have to tell Jack." Anthony nodded. "He deserves to know." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind still reeling. Jack was going to be devastated. The truth would change everything for him, destroy the life he thought he knew. But Ethan had no choice. Jack had to know the truth. They had been separated for too long, and now it was time to bring him back into the fold. even if it meant shattering the illusion he had lived with for all these years. That evening, Ethan drove to Jack's house, his heart pounding with every mile. He had the letter with him, neatly folded in his jacket pocket. He had rehearsed the conversation in his head 100 times, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of what was about to happen. When he pulled up in front of Jack's modest home, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. Ethan sat in his car for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This was it. The moment that would change everything. He knocked on the door, his hands trembling slightly. A few moments later, Jack answered, looking surprised to see him. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Jack asked, stepping aside to let him in. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice steady but his nerves on edge. "I found something." Jack frowned, sensing the seriousness in Ethan's tone. "What is it?" Ethan pulled the letter from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. "This is from our mother. It's about you. About Daniel." Jack stared at the letter, his face tightening. "You're serious?" "I am," Ethan said, handing him the letter. "Just read it." Jack hesitated, then took the letter from Ethan's hands. He sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning the page. As he read, his expression shifted. Confusion, anger, disbelief, all at once. When he finished, he looked up at Ethan, his face pale. "I don't believe this," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. She gave me away." "She was trying to protect you," Ethan said, sitting across from him. "Our father, he made enemies. She thought giving you away was the only way to keep you safe." Jack slammed the letter down on the table, his hands trembling with rage. "She lied to me. They both did." "I know it's hard," Ethan said softly. "I know this is a lot to take in. But she thought she was doing the right thing. She was trying to protect us." Jack stood up abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. All these years I've been living a lie. And for what? To protect our father. He's dead now. None of this even matters anymore. Ethan watched him, feeling the weight of Jack's anger and pain. "It matters because it's the truth, Jack. You deserve to know." Jack turned to face him, his eyes burning with fury. "And what am I supposed to do with this, huh? Just accept that I'm Daniel Williams, the brother I never knew I had, that everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie." Ethan stood up, meeting Jack's gaze. "I don't know, but we can figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone." For a long moment, Jack said nothing. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with the weight of everything that had been revealed. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice raw. "I don't know if I can do this, Ethan. I don't know if I can be Daniel again." Ethan nodded slowly. "You don't have to be, but you deserve to know the truth, and I'll be here, whatever you decide." Jack stood motionless, gripping the back of the kitchen chair, his knuckles white as the tension built up inside him. Ethan watched his brother closely, giving him space, knowing there was nothing more he could say to make this easier. The truth, now exposed, had done its damage. What Daniel, decided to do next was entirely up to him. Jack's eyes drifted back to the letter lying crumpled on the table, his whole life, neatly folded into a few lines of handwriting from a woman he had no memory of. His adoptive parents, the ones he had known and loved, had kept quiet about the origins of his life. Maybe they didn't know the full extent of what had happened before they adopted him, or maybe they had known something and decided to protect him from the harsh truth. But now, the truth had come crashing down, and it was suffocating. "You expect me to just accept this?" Jack finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You expect me to believe that my whole life, everything I've known, has been some kind of cover-up?" Ethan nodded, but cautiously. "I'm not asking you to just accept it. I know this is huge. I'm just telling you what I found, what our mother wrote. You have a right to know. You deserve the truth, no matter how hard it is to hear." Jack laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. "The truth? The truth is I've been living a lie for as long as I can remember. I built a life on false memories, on nothing. And now? Now I'm supposed to believe that I'm someone else. That I'm Daniel." The way Jack said the name, like it was foreign to him, hit Ethan hard. He had spent so many years hoping for this moment, to find his brother, to reconnect. But now that the truth was out, it wasn't a simple reunion. This wasn't the joyous moment he had imagined. This was two strangers trying to make sense of a shattered past. Ethan took a deep breath. "I know you feel lost right now, and I can't blame you for that. But this doesn't change who you are. The life you've lived, the person you've become, that's real. Your memories with your adoptive parents, the man you've grown into, that's all you. But now you know where you came from, and you can decide what to do with that information." Jack leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. "Decide? How am I supposed to decide? What do I do with all of this?" Ethan took a step closer, his voice softer. "You don't have to do anything right now. Take your time, process it. But I want you to know that I'm here for you. We've been apart for so long, but you're my brother. I've been searching for you for years. And now that I've found you, I'm not going to let you go through this alone." Jack's shoulders slumped, the weight of the situation finally crashing down on him. He had been Daniel Williams once, a long time ago. The name meant nothing to him now, but the memories were starting to stir. Small fragments of a life he had locked away. He remembered flashes, running through the fields as a boy, the smell of the farm, and the sound of his father's voice. But it was distant, like a dream he had forgotten. "I don't even know who Daniel is anymore," Jack said quietly, staring out the window into the fading daylight. "I don't know how to be that person." Ethan moved closer, placing a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You don't have to be him. You've lived your life as Jack, and that's okay. But you deserve to know where you came from, to fill in the gaps. You're not alone in this." Jack stood there, absorbing Ethan's words. His mind raced through the memories he did have, trying to make sense of them. His entire identity had been upended in the span of a single conversation, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. But the one thing he knew, the one truth that stood out, was that Ethan was his brother. Whether he liked it or not, the connection was undeniable. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Jack spoke again, his voice more controlled, but still shaky. "So what now? What do we do?" Ethan let out a small breath of relief. This was progress. "I think we need to find out more about what happened back then, about why Dad did what he did. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. The fire, the adoption, everything. We can start there." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You think there's more to it?" Ethan nodded. "I do. Our father. He wasn't the man we thought he was. He made enemies. And I think Daniel, you, were caught in the middle of something bigger than either of us realized." Jack clenched his jaw, the anger starting to simmer again. "So what? You're telling me our father gave me away because of some deal he made, or because he was in trouble? That he just threw me to the wolves?" Ethan's voice was calm, but firm. "I don't know all the details yet, but it seems like Dad was trying to protect you from something dangerous. Mom's letter said she agreed to it because she was afraid for your life." Jack shook his head, pacing the small kitchen. "It doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they just tell me? Why lie about everything?" "Maybe they thought they were keeping you safe by not telling you," Ethan suggested. "Or maybe they thought it would be easier for you to grow up without knowing." Jack stared at the floor, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. His mind was spinning, and every part of him wanted to reject what Ethan was saying, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew it was true. The pieces fit together too perfectly. The scar, the gaps in his memory, the adoption. Everything pointed to the fact that he wasn't Jack Carter, the man he had believed himself to be for so long. He was Daniel Williams, the boy who had been taken from his family all those years ago. "I need time," Jack finally said, his voice hoarse. "I need to figure this out." Ethan nodded. "Take as much time as you need. I'm not going anywhere." Jack looked up at Ethan, his expression still hard but softened by a glimmer of understanding. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't know how to rebuild his identity from the ashes of his past. But for the first time, he didn't feel completely alone. As Ethan left Jack's house that evening, he felt a mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was out in the open, but also a deep sadness for everything Jack had lost. The brother he had once known was gone, replaced by a man who had spent his life in the dark about his true origins. It would take time, perhaps more time than either of them could imagine, to make sense of it all. But for now, they had each other, and that was a start. Over the next few days, Ethan gave Jack the space he needed. He knew that pushing too hard or too fast would only drive him away. Jack needed time to process the revelation, to come to terms with the fact that the life he had known for so long was built on a lie. Ethan spent those days restless, checking his phone every few minutes, half expecting a message or call from Jack that never came. Meanwhile, his mind raced with unanswered questions. Why had their father gone to such lengths to hide Daniel's existence? What had truly happened the night of the fire? And were there still dangerous forces from their father's past lurking in the shadows? The answers were out there, Ethan knew. He just had to find them. But for now, Jack, or Daniel, as Ethan had finally allowed himself to think of him, needed to come to terms with who he was. Ethan had waited years for this moment, and if it took a little longer, he could handle that. On the third day, Ethan's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was making coffee. His heart jumped when he saw the name on the screen. "Jack, can we meet?" the message read. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a moment before he typed back, "Of course." "Where?" Jack replied quickly. "The park near my house. In an hour." Ethan put down the phone, his heart racing. This was it. Jack had finally reached out. There was no telling what kind of state of mind he was in, but at least it was a step forward. Ethan grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his thoughts swirling as he made his way to the park. When Ethan arrived, he spotted Jack sitting on a bench, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if trying to shield himself from the world. Ethan approached slowly, careful not to disrupt whatever thoughts Jack was lost in. Jack looked up as Ethan neared, his expression a mix of exhaustion and frustration. "Thanks for coming," Jack muttered, shifting on the bench to make room for Ethan to sit. "No problem," Ethan said, sitting down next to him. He waited, letting Jack start when he was ready. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet sounds of the park, the rustling of leaves, the distant laughter of children playing, filled the space between them. Jack stared at the ground, seemingly lost in thought. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the letter, about everything. It's just hard, hard to accept that everything I thought I knew is different." "I get it," Ethan replied quietly. "It's a lot to take in." Jack nodded, his jaw tightening. "I've been trying to remember things. My childhood, the fire, anything that connects me to this Daniel person. But it's all just fragments, like pieces of a dream that don't fit together." Ethan glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "What do you remember?" Jack let out a long breath. "Not much, just flashes. I remember a house, a big house and with fields around it. I remember running through the grass. There's this old swing. I can see it in my head, but I don't know where it was. And there's this voice, a man's voice, calling out to me, but I can't make out the words. It's like it's all blurred together." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. That sounds like our family's farm. There was a swing in the back, near the old barn. And the fields. We used to run through them all the time. Jack looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. That's the thing. It feels familiar, but it doesn't feel like my life. It's like I'm watching someone else's memories. That makes sense, Ethan said. You were so young when it all happened, and after the fire, you were uprooted, sent away. It's no wonder the memories are fragmented. But they're there, Jack. You haven't forgotten everything. Jack shook his head, his expression hardening. It's so damn frustrating. I want to remember, but at the same time, I don't. Part of me doesn't want to be that kid from the past. I've built a life as Jack Carter. I don't know how to be Daniel Williams. Ethan understood that more than he wanted to admit. Jack's life as a firefighter, the man he had become, was real, just as real as the life he had left behind as Daniel. But now the past had come crashing into the present, and there was no easy way to reconcile the two. You don't have to become someone else, Ethan said gently. You are who you are, Jack, or Daniel. It doesn't matter what name you use. You've lived a good life. I'm not asking you to give that up. I just want you to know the truth, to have the full picture of where you came from. Jack looked down at his hands, which were clenched into tight fists. And what about our father? What was his full picture? Why did he do this? Why did he send me away? Ethan hesitated. That's something I'm still trying to figure out. There's more to what happened with Dad than we realized. He made enemies, people who wanted to hurt our family. Mom thought giving you away was the only way to keep you safe. Jack let out a harsh laugh. Safe? You call this safe? I grew up not knowing who I was, with no idea of where I came from. They took my whole life away. Ethan's heart ached at the bitterness in Jack's voice. I know. And I can't imagine how hard that must have been, but I don't think they did it to hurt you. I think they believed they were protecting you. Jack fell silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The weight of everything hung heavy between them. The unanswered questions, the fractured memories, the years of separation. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I don't know what to do next, Ethan. I don't know how to move forward. Ethan placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. You don't have to figure it out all at once. We can take it one step at a time. There's no rush, but I want to keep looking into what happened with Dad. I think there's more we haven't uncovered yet, and I think it'll help both of us understand why things happened the way they did. Jack nodded slowly, his expression conflicted. I just don't know if I can handle it. You don't have to do it alone, Ethan said. We'll figure it out together. Jack turned to look at Ethan, and for the first time since their conversation started, there was a hint of something softer in his eyes. All right, let's see where this leads, but I'm not making any promises. Ethan smiled, relieved. That's all I'm asking. The two brothers sat in silence for a few more minutes, the tension easing as the weight of their shared history began to settle. There were still so many questions left unanswered, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving in the right direction, together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, Ethan knew that the path ahead would be long and difficult, but at least now he didn't have to walk it alone. The air was crisp as the days grew shorter, and the weight of the past seemed heavier than ever on both Ethan and Jack. Though their recent conversation had opened a door, it was still unclear what lay on the other side. The reality that Jack was, in fact, Daniel Williams lingered in the air, but neither of them knew how to fully embrace it. For the next few days, Ethan continued to investigate their father's shady past, while Jack kept to himself, wrestling with the idea of facing the life he'd left behind, whether he wanted to or not. They kept in touch through shorty-clipped messages, neither brother fully ready to dive into the emotional chaos that would come with reliving the fire and everything that followed. Ethan spent hours digging through old records and files with Anthony's help. They unearthed business dealings, real estate ventures, and even some threatening letters addressed to their father from nameless, faceless enemies. It was all starting to make sense. Their father had been involved in dangerous circles, and Daniel's disappearance had been the collateral damage of something much larger. But what remained elusive was the why. Why had their father chosen to give Daniel away instead of finding another solution? And what, if anything, had their mother kept from them beyond what was in the letter? One evening, after another long day of searching for answers, Ethan received a text from Jack. "Come over tomorrow. We need to talk." Ethan's pulse quickened. Jack was ready for another conversation. He didn't know if this would be the moment Jack accepted his identity as Daniel, but it was a step forward, and that was enough for now. The next morning, Ethan drove to Jack's house with a mix of hope and anxiety. As he pulled up to the curb, he saw Jack waiting on the porch, his expression serious but calm. Ethan got out of the car and walked up the steps, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Thanks for coming," Jack said, stepping aside to let Ethan in. "No problem," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's on your mind?" Jack didn't waste any time. He motioned for Ethan to sit at the kitchen table, then took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about the truth, about our father, about everything." Ethan nodded, waiting for Jack to continue. "And I realized something," Jack said, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to be Daniel Williams." Ethan's heart sank. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it out loud was like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" Jack rubbed his hands together, looking down at the table as he spoke. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to remember who Daniel was, trying to connect with this person that you've told me about, but I can't. I can't be him. I don't want to be him." Ethan felt a wave of sadness wash over him. "You don't have to give up your life as Jack. You've built something for yourself. I'm not asking you to leave that behind." Jack shook his head, his jaw clenched. "It's not that simple. You don't understand. Daniel is a ghost. He's someone I don't know, someone I don't remember. I've spent years creating a life for myself as Jack Carter, and it's a good life. I've got a job I love, friends who care about me. I don't want to dig up the past anymore. I don't want to be haunted by it." Ethan leaned forward, his voice gentle. "I get that, Jack. I do. But the past is part of who you are, whether you like it or not. You don't have to live as Daniel, but you can't ignore the truth." Jack stood up abruptly, pacing the room. "That's just it, though. I don't know if I can live with that truth. I'm not sure I want to know all the answers anymore. I've seen what digging into the past has done to you, how it's consumed you. I don't want that for myself." Ethan felt the sting of Jack's words, but he knew there was some truth in them. He had been consumed by the search for Daniel, by the need to uncover the truth. And now that he had found it, the relief he had expected was nowhere to be found. Instead, it had only raised more questions, more pain. "I'm not trying to drag you into the past," Ethan said, standing up to face Jack. "I just want you to know where you came from. I want you to have the choice, to understand the full picture." Jack turned to him, his eyes hard. "And what if I don't want that choice? What if I don't want to go digging anymore? I've spent years as Jack Carter. That's who I am. I don't want to be Daniel. I don't need to be." Ethan's chest tightened. "But you are Daniel, whether you accept it or not." Jack slammed his hand down on the table, frustration boiling over. "I don't want to be. Don't you get it? I've lived my life without Daniel, and I'm fine with that. I don't want to be dragged back into that world, into that family. I've moved on." Ethan stared at him, stunned into silence. The weight of Jack's decision hit him like a ton of bricks. All these years, Ethan had been waiting for this moment, for the chance to bring his brother back into his life. But now, faced with the reality of it, he realized that Jack didn't want to be found. He didn't want to go back to being Daniel. "So, what are you saying?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack ran a hand over his face, his frustration giving way to exhaustion. I'm saying I need to let go of the past. I need to live my life as Jack, the person I've built. I can't be someone I don't remember. I don't want to be. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat grow. And what about us? What about being brothers? Jack's face softened, and he sat back down, looking Ethan in the eye. We're still brothers. That doesn't change. I'm not walking away from that, but I need you to respect my choice. I can't go back to being someone I don't know. I need to move forward as Jack. That's who I am now. Ethan felt a wave of sadness, but also understanding. Jack had every right to choose his path, even if it wasn't the one Ethan had hoped for. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth. Okay, I respect that. I just don't want to lose you again. Jack gave him a small, tired smile. You won't. We'll figure this out together. But on my terms. Ethan exhaled, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. All right, I can live with that. For a long time, they sat in silence, the tension slowly ebbing away. It wasn't the outcome Ethan had expected, but it was something. Jack had made his choice, and Ethan had to respect that. They would still be brothers, still connected, even if Jack couldn't fully embrace the past. After what felt like hours, Jack spoke again, his voice softer now. What are you going to do about Dad? About everything you've uncovered? Ethan thought for a moment, then sighed. I don't know. There's a lot we still don't know about why Dad did what he did, but I think I've dug up enough for now. Maybe it's time to let it rest. Jack nodded, seeming to understand. Maybe that's for the best. We can't change the past. No, Ethan agreed, but we can move forward. Jack smiled faintly, a hint of relief in his eyes. Yeah, I think it's time for that. The decision had been made. Daniel, had chosen his path, and Ethan had no choice but to respect it. The weight of years of searching, hoping, and longing for this moment had culminated in a bittersweet reality. Jack was his brother, but he didn't want to be Daniel again. It was a choice Ethan hadn't anticipated, but as he drove away from Jack's house that day, a strange sense of peace began to settle over him. Ethan had spent so long clinging to the idea of finding Daniel, of putting their fractured family back together, that he hadn't considered what it would mean for Jack. For all his digging, he had failed to see how difficult this was for him, the man who had built a life out of the ashes of a forgotten past, only to have it thrown into question. And now, after everything, they had reached an understanding. Jack, Daniel, would continue his life as he saw fit. And Ethan would have to let go of the image of his long-lost brother coming back into the fold. They were brothers, yes, but they had become different people, shaped by different lives. The past, with all its pain and confusion, would remain in the past. They had to move forward, even if that meant going in different directions. A week passed without much communication between the two of them. Ethan returned to his business, throwing himself back into the demands of the corporate world, but he found it difficult to fully engage. His mind often wandered back to Jack, to everything that had unfolded. The unanswered questions still gnawed at him, the fire, the enemies, the life their father had led. But a part of him had made peace with not knowing all the answers. Some things, he realized, were better left buried. One afternoon, as Ethan sat in his office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Jack. Hey, been thinking. Let's grab a drink sometime soon. A small smile tugged at Ethan's lips as he replied, Absolutely. Let me know when. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that their relationship, though altered, wasn't lost. They would find a way to be brothers, even if it wasn't in the way Ethan had originally hoped. The connection they shared was real, even if the past was too fragmented to fully restore. A few days later, Ethan met Jack at a quiet bar on the edge of the city. It was a small, dimly lit place, far from the usual upscale spots Ethan frequented for business meetings. But this wasn't about business. This was about reconnection, about finding a way forward. Jack was already seated at the bar when Ethan walked in, nursing a beer and staring thoughtfully into the distance. When he saw Ethan approach, he offered a brief nod and a half smile. "Glad you could make it," Jack said as Ethan slid onto the stool next to him. "Wouldn't miss it," Ethan replied, signaling the bartender for a drink. For a while, they talked about mundane things, work, the latest news, the kind of small talk that brothers should have been able to share naturally over the years, but hadn't. It felt strange, in a way, to be speaking so casually after the emotional upheaval of the last few weeks. But it also felt right. They were trying to find their rhythm, to figure out what it meant to be brothers after so much time apart. Eventually, the conversation turned back to the topic that had brought them together in the first place. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jack began, glancing over at Ethan. "About Dad. About everything." Ethan nodded, taking a sip of his drink. "Yeah?" Jack leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bar. "I don't know if I'll ever understand why he did what he did, why he kept everything a secret, why he sent me away. But I'm starting to realize that I can't let it define who I am. He made his choices, and I have to live with the consequences. But that doesn't mean I have to carry his burden forever." Ethan looked at his brother, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Jack had come a long way in accepting the truth, even if he hadn't embraced the identity of Daniel. "You're right," Ethan said quietly. "We don't have to carry his mistakes. We're our own people now. You don't have to live in the shadow of what he did." Jack nodded slowly, as if the weight of that realization was still settling in. "I'm not ready to dig any deeper. I don't think I ever will be. But I'm not running from it anymore. I can accept that Daniel was a part of me, even if I don't remember much. But Jack, that's who I am now." Ethan smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "I understand, and I respect that. I'm just glad you're here, that we found each other, even if it's not the way I imagined." Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, life doesn't usually go the way we plan, does it?" They both laughed, the tension easing as they clinked their glasses together. It wasn't the perfect ending Ethan had once envisioned, but it was real. Jack had chosen to move forward as Jack Carter, and Ethan had to accept that. They were still brothers, and they still had time to rebuild their relationship on their own terms. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew lighter, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that they could move past the pain and the lies. Hope that they could create something new out of the broken pieces of their past. When it was time to leave, Jack stood up and clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "I'm glad we did this. Let's not wait so long next time." "Agreed," Ethan said, smiling. "Take care of yourself, all right?" Jack gave a quick nod before walking out into the cool night air. Ethan watched him go, feeling a sense of closure that had eluded him for so long. The truth was out, the mystery solved, but life, as it often did, had moved in unexpected directions. As Ethan made his way home, he realized that he didn't need to dig any further into the past. His father's mistakes, the enemies, the secrets, all of it could rest where it belonged. Ethan had found his brother, and that was enough. Jack had chosen his own path, and Ethan would walk his beside him, no matter where it led. In the end, they were brothers, and that bond, despite everything, was unbreakable.